Long before Game of Thrones dominated bookshelves and television, Lord of the Rings was the king of the fantasy and adventure fiction genre. It even had very successful big screen adaptations. If you were alive when they came out, you probably went to see at least one of them. There's no reason to delve into the semantics of the series here because it would take forever to explain everything to the uninitiated. Long story short, it involves rings, fantasy creatures, and lots of walking.
It is way off, loser.
Lord of the Rings also had a huge effect on pop culture. As often as it's referenced, one could argue that it still is. And when things become pop culture crazes, they often become video games. One of the most successful Lord of the Rings games in recent history was released in late 2014, known as Shadow of Mordor. An open-world adventure game, Shadow of Mordor puts you in the boots of Talion, a ranger of Gondor, who loses his loved ones but becomes cursed and denied death. He bonds soon after to the wraith of the elf lord Celebrimbor, and both characters' lust for vengeance due to the deaths of their families is a major early plot point that drives the entire narrative. Seeing as the sequel, Shadow of War, is releasing on October 10th, the iron is hot. It's time to gather our armies and ride into the world of Shadow of Mordor. Shadow of Mordor shares a lot of similarities with open-world games like Grand Theft Auto in that the main game is primarily jumping from mission to mission. In doing so, you gradually grow in power and become better capable of handling the game's increasing difficulty. Like many open-world adventure games, you can do anything you feel like you want to do. There are no time limits here, and the game's maps are almost completely open to you from the moment you step into them. You can spend hours just roaming the game map, killing orcs and activating forge towers, the game's fast travel points, before even activating the first mission in the game. This freedom of choice is encouraged by the game, because there's never a shortage of enemies to kill, captains to hunt, and artifacts and elvish seals to acquire. Unless you're the kind of person who prefers to rush straight through the game from start to finish, you'll find plenty to keep yourself occupied. The primary resources in the game are XP, power, and Miriam. EXP helps you to acquire ability points, which let you unlock new abilities for Talion that make certain aspects of the game easier, traveling more streamlined, or give you more options in combat. You can gain more power by killing captains or disrupting Sauron's army, which unlocks new sets of abilities. Miriam can be spent increasing health or adding additional runes to your weapons, among other things. Parkour is another major focus of the game, allowing you to climb or cross almost any obstacle you encounter. Staying above enemies is one of the best ways to remain undetected, allowing you to pick and choose your targets. It's encouraged to do so, as there are many instances where fighting orcs on their level, especially in the early game, can get you mobbed and killed. Luckily, the combat system is fast, fluid, and satisfying, and the emphasis on chaining together combos rewards good gameplay. If the combat system seems familiar to you, it's because it's likely taken from the Batman Arkham series of games, which makes sense when you realize that Monolith Productions, the developers of Shadow of Mordor, is a subsidiary of Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, the developers of the Arkham series. Another great aspect of Shadow of Mordor is what the game calls the Nemesis system, and it's probably my favorite addition to the game. At first, the system keeps track of captains and warchiefs who fight for power and status. Later in the game, it allows you more opportunity to influence the system by branding and manipulating captains, making their forces your own to aid you in combat. The Nemesis system also has a heavy slant on gathering intel on certain captains, exposing their strengths and weaknesses, so you know how best to kill them. It also lets the game keep track of who's killed you or who you've allowed to survive, and they'll grow in power as a result. They'll also recognize you each time you come across them again. Here are a few of my favorite lines.
You live again! This means we're going to have so much fun! Over and over and over! Think you just helped me earn some time off?
Each time is a nice treat because the voice work in this game is spectacular. Most of the main missions in the game drive the story along, following Talion in his quest for vengeance against the Black Hand of Sauron and his allies. Many of these missions serve as tutorials that quietly teach you about things you can do in the game. This includes things that may not be obvious at first, like sneaking, stealth kills, and combat finishers. Every mission also has additional bonus objectives that earn you additional Mirian. These aren't necessary, but having more Mirian only helps you to enhance Talion's capabilities faster. In addition to the game's usual story and side missions, there are also missions that allow you to avenge the deaths of other players. It's a fun extra that grants you plenty of the game's resources if you're successful, and each time you die, there's always a possibility that another player may avenge your death one day. Runes are also another great aspect of the game, though they play less of a role compared to other systems. Your bow, sword, and dagger each have their own unique set of runes that enhance your combat capabilities or offer you other advantages. It's your choice to pick which of these runes you wish to use that best benefits your playstyle, and active players will have plenty to use as their captain body count rises. Each time you kill a captain or warchief, they drop a rune. These vary in strength depending on which strengths or weaknesses you took advantage of and the power of the captain himself, so no two runes you obtain as you play through the game are going to be the same. One of the advantages of playing games from recent years is that they tend to look good. Even though Shadow of Mordor is from 2014, the game's still easy on the eyes. The protagonist models look great. They did stellar work on the orcs, but that's probably because the game often zooms in very close to them. They probably realized that these models needed special focus. The music in Shadow of Mordor are solid orchestrations, and may make some players nostalgic that appreciated the soundtrack from the Lord of the Rings or Hobbit movie trilogies. While the soundtrack is great, I didn't realize it was playing most of the time. Story-centric gameplay sections and cutscenes were a different story, and the music fit these scenes perfectly, evoking the right kinds of emotions at the right time. For example, when Talion is training his son in combat, the music is light and playful.
The best your father.
Hard enough?
Parry, son. Don't forget to block.
Perhaps you should not forget to hit.
Stay alert, dear. Your enemy will not always be as he appears.
Another example is when Talion encounters a shifty little runt of an orc named Ratbag. The music that plays during these cutscenes evoke a sense of awkward mistrust between Ratbag and Talion.
It's the warchiefs. Strong leaders they are. Now if something were to happen to them, then they wouldn't be able to stop your little insurrection, would they?
I would hunt them down.
How?
Shadow of Mordor does have a few issues that keep it from being a better game. One example is that the maps are small. The game is good at deceiving the player, making it seem like the world is bigger than it is. This is because it often forces you into situations where you need to move vertically to continue, or enemies are placed in a way to force you to either engage or avoid them. It would be boring if Shadow of Mordor's maps were just completely flat or made in a way that made it easier to avoid confrontation, but the deception is obvious after a few hours of gameplay. This is exacerbated by the fact that Caragors, the game's most common mount, are very fast, and the game encourages you to ride them when necessary. Caragor riding is also very clunky and loose. If you do anything other than run in a straight line, Caragors can be frustrating to utilize. If you're trying to sprint in mid-combat, it's not uncommon for your Caragor to just leap up nearby walls, which wastes several seconds as you try desperately to correct the creature's course. They're effective during battles, but riding them around during combat can be a challenge. Some captains you encounter can quickly kill or do a lot of damage to attacking Caragor, making riding them a bit of a liability from time to time. While we're on the topic of maps, there's not much to look at because everything looks similar. Most of the strongholds all have a similar ruinous or shoddily constructed look, while all the terrain between these areas have nothing truly interesting to look at. There's a cave in the first area of the game that looks exactly like a cave in the second area of the game, with a few small tweaks and additions. I get that there's only so many ways to render a cave, but there's an obvious lack of effort here. The mission boundaries are very strict. Most missions have a big green circle showing you where you're restricted to, and that's understandable in most cases. Yet, some missions have transitionary periods that lack these, failing your mission if you wander too far off from the game's chosen path. This isn't a big deal normally, but sometimes when walking along with an NPC, you'll notice an elvish seal, artifact, or forge tower that you haven't gotten yet. You'll just have to watch longingly as you walk by, conveniently near the area it's contained in, yet unable to acquire it. There's also a minor problem of having too much to do in the game. The saying less is more applies here, as most maps have tons of things to collect or missions to complete. Completing side missions often unlock other side missions, and sometimes the game unlocks side missions for you for just doing things like liberating slaves. If you play through the game, exploring to gather collectibles and doing side missions before tackling story missions like I did, you'll probably clock in around 12 hours. I'd imagine a hardcore completionist could probably wrap the game up in its entirety around 20 hours, making Shadow of Mordor a short game even when taken at a slow pace. Of course, this is only a review of the base Shadow of Mordor game. I consider reviewing the DLC, seeing as I had the Game of the Year edition. That would have taken much longer to get the review out, and not much seems to be different between the DLC and the main game. However, the DLC does build on Shadow of Mordor's lore. For example, the Bright Lord DLC follows the events of Celebrimbor as he seeks to challenge Sauron, the main antagonist of both the books and the game, and rescue his family, and it helps players fill in some of the blanks associated with the game's primary content. Shadow of Mordor is, again, a game from 2014 and can be acquired without spending too much money. As of this review, the Game of the Year edition is $20 on Steam, which is a fair price for the content available here, but has gone down as low as $4 during sales. If you're the kind of person, like me, who wait for sales to purchase their games, $4 is absolutely worth picking this game up to play, especially if you're a fan of the books or movies and the lore behind it. And looks like this is the end. Thanks for checking out this review. If you enjoyed my content, consider supporting me by letting your friends know about my channel, or, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and check out my other great videos. There are also links to our Twitter, Minds, and Twitch pages in the description so you can join us on social media. We'll see you next time.